Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Just a heads up, Cory Doctorow's book is called Enshittification, and yes, the language in this episode is just as spicy as you might imagine. We're not going to bleep the title or other strong language within, so consider this your friendly notice before we get started. So, take it from an old like me. The web used to be awesome, but it kind of sucks now. Platforms that once felt open, empowering, and even magical now feel exhausting, maybe even dangerous. So Cory Doctorow calls this slow motion collapse enshittification, which is my favorite word ever. That is a cycle driven not by accident, but by deliberate corporate choices that lock in users, squeeze us, and eventually hollow out the systems that we rely on. So the real question is, if the internet was broken by design, can we unbreak it? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. In his latest book, Enshittification, best title ever, Cory Doctorow explains how our once promising web was reshaped by business models that reward extraction over service. Cory joins us today to talk about the path toward an internet that once again serves people, not the other way around. Now, here's something really cool. You can buy it in print or you can buy it as a DRM-free ebook. As we get started here today, I would like to welcome Brewster Kale, the Internet Archive's digital librarian.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm so glad this is all happening. And gosh, welcome Cory once again. I think of Cory as both a really good friend, but also the spokesperson for the open world in terms of going and driving forward tech to have a social conscious and also be fit for purpose of serving the public. There's no better spokesperson than Cory Doctorow. I'm just so happy. I know this is a busy schedule, but thank you for your work. And the Internet Archive will support you any which way we possibly can.
Thanks, Brewster. I will turn things over to Dave Hansen, who is Executive Director of Authors Alliance, and he will set the stage for today's discussion.
Thanks, Chris. I'm a huge fan, but I am not a fan of enshittification. I'm a fan of the book. I'm not a fan of the trajectory that the web has taken. And part of the reason for that is I hear from authors almost every day about the problems that they face with the internet turning into what it has become, which is basically a collection of 5 or 6 companies dominating the industry and creating products that slowly get worse and worse over time. And I think from an author standpoint, the real challenge that most authors face today is trying to reach readers. That's the thing that I hear about over and over and over again. And frequently, what I see happen is authors are sold this false promise of additional copyright or additional control over their intellectual property as like the be all end all solution to helping them do better with their work, to earn more money, to accomplish their goals. And what's so funny about that is those problems are being sold to them by the same companies that are slowly degrading their ability to operate online and reach people. So I'm a huge fan of this book. I think it's such an important topic. And I'm also a huge fan of Cory. I never quite know how to introduce Cory. He's a science fiction author. He's an activist. He's an intellectual. He just covers so much ground. I will tell you my favorite story of Cory's has nothing to do with copyright law, and I think that's because I spend so much time thinking about it. Cory, my favorite story that you've ever written is about a system administrator who survives an apocalypse. And part of the reason I like that is it kind of reminds me in a way of the internet before it turned into what it is now, when we had these people kind of working it quietly behind the scenes, making the open web happen. And it seems like we've lost some of that.
Well, thank you. So, hi, everyone. Like you heard, I have worked on these issues for quite some time. I'm an activist with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been there for 24 years, which is a remarkable number. We are a digital rights group. We kind of work on making sure that your human rights follow you onto the internet, and that these days that the internet isn't taking away the human rights out there in the physical world. We are, among other things, the archive's lawyers from time to time. And Brewster is from time to time one of our board members. So we have a very intimate relationship with the archive, one, I think, of the great institutions of the modern internet, and indeed one that's been with us for a lot of the history of the internet as well. And when you're an activist on these digital rights issues, the job is complicated by the fact that the issues are so complicated, they're so far off, they're so technical and abstract that it can be really hard for people to feel a sense of urgency around them. And as a result, a lot of this job consists of coming up with metaphors, similes, parables, framing devices, and occasionally silly words to talk about this stuff as an entry for people. And I coined this silly word, enshittification, and discovered to my pleasant surprise that a minor license to vulgarity is the key for unlocking popular interest in very abstract technical questions. And so here I am with this new book out that is crystallizing some of the work I've done for a quarter of a century, most of my adult life. And my intention here today is to describe it to you. And I'll start by talking about the observational component of enshittification, because it splits into two pieces. It is both a description of what happens to platforms and also a description of why this is happening now. So platforms are the endemic form of institution on the internet, and there's a good reason for that, despite the fact that we were all very excited about disintermediation in the early days of the internet. Intermediaries, people who help you get stuff done, they're not necessarily bad. I grew up in Toronto, like all the best Americans, I'm a Canadian. And there was a guy in Toronto who's sort of an outsider author who called himself Crad Kolodny. And he used to write and edit and publish his own stories, typeset them, everything in these chapbooks, which he would then sell on the street in Toronto with a sign around his neck that said, "Very famous Canadian author, buy my books." Or when he was feeling a bit salty, he would just have a sign that says, "Margaret Atwood." And I loved Crad. He was quite a character. He was like the Lakota. He used the whole experience of being an independent author. He used to secretly record the drunks who harassed him and then put out cassette tapes of best ofs of the harassment he endured. You can actually get these on the Internet Archive. I discovered to my enormous satisfaction. They are called On the Street with Crad Kolodny, volumes 1 through 3. Now, as much as I loved the work that he did, there are a lot of writers I want to hear from who can write their own work but can't edit it, much less typeset it, much less arrange to have it printed, much less stand on a sub-zero street corner in Toronto selling their own books and enduring harassment by drunks. And so I like the idea that we have these things, booksellers, libraries, publishers, publishing houses, printers, all these other things. And as much as we need those in the physical world, we need them even more in the digital world. It's a rare person who has something to say about the internet, who is capable of gnawing a web server out of a whole log with their own teeth, much less providing their own fiber, much less doing their own payment processing, DDoS protection, name service, and so on. And even if you are that person with the giant Unix beard who can do all of those things, you probably don't want to do all of them. There's some of them you'd rather have someone else do for you. So intermediaries are fun. The problem is that intermediaries get too big for their britches. They stop being a helper and they start being a gatekeeper. My old friend Tim Wu's out there touring a new book called Age of Extraction. Tim and I went to elementary school together. We've known each other since we were 9 years old. Tim says that these platforms, they have main character syndrome. They forget that their job is to help us, and they think that we're there to help them get rich. And so as platforms have become more and more concentrated and more powerful, they've started to decay, and they follow a characteristic pattern of decay. And it's a 3-stage pattern. In stage 1, they're good to their end users while finding a way to lock those users in. And so in the case of Facebook, say, which is kind of an case here, you have a platform that wanted to steal users away from an existing social media platform called MySpace. And Mark Zuckerberg, he made a pitch to the MySpace users. He said, "Look, I know you love the friends that you hang out with on MySpace, but I don't know if you know this, but MySpace is owned by an evil, crapulent, senescent, immortal Australian vampire named Rupert Murdoch, who's an evil billionaire. And he spies on you with every hour that God sends. And, the last thing you want is a social media network owned by a billionaire who spies on you. Come to Facebook, we won't spy on you, and I'll be your pal." And so we flocked in to Facebook. And we got locked into Facebook too. And other kinds of tech need to do elaborate things to lock you in. They have to use DRM or predatory pricing to drive out their rivals or whatever. With social media, we do the lock-in ourselves. We're holding each other hostage. There's something that economists call the collective action problem, but that you can think of as you love your friends, but they're a pain in the ass. You got a half dozen people in a group chat that you love hanging out with, but you can't even agree on what board game you're going to play this weekend, much less when it's time for all of you to leave Facebook, especially if some of you are there because that's where the people who have the same rare disease as you are hanging out. And some of you are there because that's where the people in the country you emigrated from talk to you. And some of you are there because that's where you meet your customers or your audience. Or some of you are there because that's how you organize the Little League football carpool. And so you just not only have to convince your friends to go, you have to convince all those friends, other critical networks to leave too. So we get locked in. And once we're locked in, it's time to move on to stage 2 of enshittification, which is making things worse for end users in order to make things better for business customers. So once Mark Zuckerberg knows that it's hard for you to leave, he can turn the screws on you without risking your departure. And he does that in service to tempting in first advertisers, whom he says, hey, I know we told these rubes we weren't going to spy on them. Obviously, we were lying to them. We spy on them from asshole to appetite. Give us a relatively small amount of money. We'll target ads to them with exquisite fidelity. And because we are such, dedicated craftspeople, we've installed this building full of anti-ad fraud engineers next door. And they're just going to make sure that anytime you give us $1 to show an ad to a specific user, that user is getting that ad shoved right in their face. And then he goes to the publishers and he says, hey, do you remember we told these suckers we were only going to show them the things they asked to see? Obviously, we were totally lying about that too. If you just put excerpts from your website on Facebook, we'll cram them into the eyeballs of people who never asked to see them. Some of them will click on the link and then you'll get a free traffic funnel. So the advertisers, the publishers, they pile in too. And they get locked in to something called a monopsony. So all of us know about Monopoly because we were forced to play the board game at the cottage with our family until we wanted to kill them and ourselves. But very few of us, unless you've read economics or unless you're a small business person, are as familiar with the idea of monopsony, which is not the idea of a powerful seller, but the idea of a powerful buyer, someone you supply things to, like ads or content. And monopsony power is much easier to establish and much easier to maintain because businesses are much more sensitive to a single customer of a relatively small size. Like, imagine there's a block near your house with 5 coffee shops on it, and one of them is next to an office building that gets 20% of its business from the workers in that building. And that office goes bankrupt, and the gross receipts for that coffee shop tank, 20% overnight cut. That coffee shop may not survive. Right? A 20% cut in gross receipts without warning to a small business means that you can't make the payment on your loans, you can't make your payroll, you're going to need rent relief from your landlord. And so that might be the last day that coffee shop's in business. Now, even if that was your favorite coffee shop, there's 4 other coffee shops on the block. A 20% reduction in supply as opposed to demand is pretty easy for you to absorb. And so once Facebook has even a relatively small amount of the business that advertisers and publishers rely on, it can exercise enormous control over them. And so that's stage 3, making things worse for business customers in order to deliver benefit to shareholders and investors. So I want to pause for just a moment here and say that there is this idea that I think is wrong, that the reason the internet is bad is because you didn't shop with sufficient care, and that if you weren't paying for the product, you would be the product. I think the thing that we see from the maltreatment that I'm about to introduce of the publishers and the advertisers is that it doesn't matter if you pay for the product. The thing that determines whether you are treated as the product is whether the firm can get away with treating you as the product. It has nothing to do with a kind of customer loyalty program where giving them money causes them to deliver to you the dignity that you should be afforded just for being a human being. It has to do with the discipline that they labor under and whether or not a failure to treat you with that dignity results in harmful effects to their bottom line. And so here we have the publishers and the advertisers locked in, and Facebook puts the screws to them. Ad targeting fidelity goes way down. Ad prices go way up, and ad fraud explodes. Procter & Gamble zeroed out its advertising budget, surveillance advertising budget in 2017. They went from $200 million a year for surveillance ads to 0. and they saw a 0% drop in sales because, to a first approximation, all $200 million was disappearing down the fraud hole. Publishers, meanwhile, find that they have to put longer and longer excerpts on Facebook just to be shown to their own subscribers, much less to be recommended. And eventually, what they find themselves having to do is just replicate their website, the whole article, and woe betide the publisher that adds a link, because that might be a malicious link. And so Facebook downranks that post. And so now you're just a commodity backend supplier to Facebook. And the only way that you can get any monetization is with that corrupt ad network. And so now you have the final stage of enshittification. All the value has been withdrawn. Your feed consists of like a kind of homeopathic residue of the things you asked to see. There is a void that results that is filled with things people will pay to show you, but those people are being ripped off to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And all the value has been harvested for the investors and for the executives. And the problem from Facebook's perspective is this is a very brittle equilibrium, right? All it takes to knock you from, I hate this place, but I can't seem to stop going here, and I hate this place, and I'm never coming back, is just like one little nudge, like a live stream mass shooting. And then people bolt for the exits. Wall Street gets cold feet. The share price tanks. And then the company panics. And being technical people, they have a technical term for panicking. They call it pivoting. And so it is that one day Mark Zuckerberg arose from his sarcophagus and he said, "Hearken to me, brothers and sisters, for I've had a vision. I know that I told you that your future would consist entirely of arguing with your most racist uncle using the primitive text interface I invented in my Harvard dorm room to non-consensually rate the fuckability of my fellow undergraduates. However, it turns out that the true future consists of me converting you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character so that I can imprison you and all of the people that you care about in a virtual world I stole from a 25-year-old satirical dystopian cyberpunk novel that I call the metaverse." And that is the end stage of enshittification, the giant pile of shit. So we can recognize iterations of this with all the platforms that we rely on. It can be quite frustrating and scary given the extent to which we do rely on them. But what's a more salient question, I think, than like, how is this happening, is why is it happening? Because after all, we didn't invent greed in the middle of the last decade. Digital platforms have been able to change the rules on their users since they started. You could always, turn surveillance on or raise prices, do these other things. So what is it that caused these platforms to get worse in the last 10 years? My theory is that in order to understand this, you have to ask why they didn't get worse before. Because after all, the kind of platonic ideal of a firm under capitalism, if you're an investor, is a company that charges infinity for its wares, delivers as little value as possible, and pays nothing to its suppliers. And I understand that I am describing an academic publisher, but most businesses don't get to operate that way. Most businesses have a little more discipline on them than that. They have to worry about competitors. But we did allow the tech platforms to buy all their competitors, even when they admitted that they were buying the competitors for anti-competitive reasons. When Mark Zuckerberg bought Instagram, his CFO said, "Hey, why are we giving $1 billion to a company with only 12 employees?" And he wrote an email back, because Mark Zuckerberg is a man who's never had a criminal intention. He didn't immediately commit to writing and then email to someone else. And he said, "Hey, we're buying Instagram because people like them more than us. And when they leave here, they don't go back to Facebook. And so if we buy them, we can reduce competition." And despite the fact that this is the equivalent in antitrust law of saying, "Hey, Bob, that guy we were thinking about killing, just so you know it's a murder and I'm premeditating it," the Obama administration and the European Commission just waved that merger through the way they did for every company and every acquisition. Amazon, Apple, Google. Apple's buying 90 companies a year. They're bringing home a new startup for their investors more often than you're bringing home groceries for the kids, right? So these companies were not worried about competition because they didn't have to compete anymore. They just bought anyone who looked inconvenient. And then that means that once you're not worried about competitors and you're not worried about your customers jumping ship, it also means that your sector has dwindled to a very cozy handful of companies. This orgy of mergers produces a kind of inbred cartel that's like so interbred that they have corporate Habsburg jaws. And they find it very easy to decide what lie they're going to tell to their regulators. And they have so much money because they don't compete anymore that they can make it stick. I mean, think about Google and Apple. Google pays Apple a bribe every year of more than $20 billion not to enter the search market, right? So that means that Google doesn't have to worry about eroding its margins and Apple doesn't have to worry about eroding its margins. And the two of them can take the money that's left over and gang up on regulators to make sure that the regulators do what they want. So we lose regulatory discipline too. But in tech, we have other sources of discipline beyond just competition and regulation. For one thing, we have the tech workforce, who are historically very, very powerful. Tech workers were not unionized, but in a sense, they didn't need to, at least not while they were very scarce, because they were also very valuable. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the average Silicon Valley engineer was adding $1 million a year to their boss's bottom line. This is why your boss treated you good if you were a tech worker. It's why you got free kombucha. It's why you got the massages. It's why you got the luxury bus. It's why the surgeon would freeze your eggs so you could work through your fertile years. It wasn't because they liked you. It was because if you walked out the door and took a job with someone else, $1 million walked out the door with you. And since so many of those tech workers were like Tron pilled, they wanted to fight for the user. If their boss ordered them to enshittify the thing that they had missed their mother's funeral to ship on time, they could just say fuck off because there was someone across the street who would give them a job by lunchtime. And so their bosses just couldn't make them do things that they didn't want to do. So the tech workers held the line. But if you get power from scarcity and you don't consolidate it with solidarity, if you don't unionize, if you let yourself get suckered into thinking that you're a temporarily embarrassed founder or an entrepreneur in waiting, then as soon as supply catches up with demand, like it has now, 500,000 tech layoffs in the last 3 years, biggest tech layoff month ever in October since 2000, then your boss doesn't have to worry about you. And you should be worried about that because we know how tech bosses treat the workers that they're not worried about, right? That's the people who assemble iPhones in China whose factory has a suicide net around it. It's the people who work at a Facebook or an Amazon warehouse who are injured at 3 times the national rate. It's the drivers for Amazon who have to pee in a bottle. Sure, you're a programmer for Amazon. You get to show up with like a pink mohawk and facial piercings and a black t-shirt that says things your boss doesn't understand but feels vaguely uncomfortable about. But there's nothing about working behind a keyboard that says you can't have a pee bottle next to you. And so you should be really worried about what's going to happen once your boss is no longer afraid of you. But even beyond workers, even beyond regulators, even beyond competition, there was one other force that really did hold tech enshittification at bay. And that was something called interoperability, making two things work together. And in computers, we get interoperability like in no other sector. The only computer we know how to make is something computer scientists call the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, which is a lot of jargon that just means an engine capable of calculating every valid program, which is to say that if someone installs a 10-foot pile of shit and a piece of software you rely on, there's an 11-foot ladder made out of code that someone can generate for you, hand over to you, and you can just go straight over it. They lock your printer so it only takes proprietary ink. Well, someone can just install a program in your printer that turns off the ink checking routine. If they lock your phone so that it only takes apps from the manufacturer, someone can install a program in your phone that lets you take apps from anyone. If they steal your data, if they steal your privacy, someone can install a privacy blocker in your device. And indeed, that's what's happened on the web. 51% of us have installed an ad blocker on the web, which is a way of defending your privacy. It's the largest consumer boycott in human history. But what's happened over the last 20 years is a monotonic expansion of what we call loosely IP law, by which I mean any law that allows a company to reach beyond the walls of its firm and exert control over its competitors, its critics, and its customers. Most notable among these is something called anti-circumvention law, which is a blanket prohibition on modifying technology if the manufacturer has designed it not to be modified. In other words, if the programmer goes into the code and draws a kind of chalk outline around some of it and writes next to it, "Don't modify this code," then modifying the code, even looking hard at that code, becomes illegal. Under Section 1201 of the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it's a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine to circumvent an access control, even for a lawful purpose, even in a device you own. So it is that Congress has never passed a law that says you are not allowed to modify your printer so that it can use third-party ink. They've never passed a law that says you must buy ink from HP. But because they passed a law saying you can't remove a digital lock, bypass an access control, HP and the cartel of 3 or 4 firms that have now captured the inkjet printer market have raised and raised and raised the price of ink to the point where now it is the most expensive fluid you can buy as a civilian without getting a special permit at $10,000 a gallon. It would be cheaper for you to print your grocery list with the semen of a Kentucky Derby winning stallion, right? So here we are in this moment where we have unshackled firms from discipline, where we've made it so that if they abuse us, they make more money because they don't face competitors or regulators or the disapprobation of their precious workers or new market entry through interoperability, and they are fully insulated from negative consequences, and so they abuse us. They abuse us for the same reason your dog licks its balls, because they can, because we don't stop them from doing it. So what does it take to fix this? And I'm gonna close out here so we can go to Q&A about the specifics of this. Um, we can think about this in the kind of galaxy brain meme where you've got the three different explanations. And the first explanation is, oh, well, you, the almighty consumer, failed to shop with sufficient care. You forgot that if you aren't paying for the product, you're the product. You didn't shop your way out of the monopoly. And because you are the secret arbiter of all things, it's because of you and it's your fault. And you should feel very bad about yourself. And from now on, all you should do is just agonize about your consumption choices. This is a very dumb argument. This is like saying, oh, well, if you're worried about the wildfires in Mendocino, you should recycle harder, right? This is not a problem of individual choices. It's a systemic problem. And because it's a systemic problem, it means that stage 2 of the galaxy brain meme isn't right either. We can't just blame the ketamine-addled Zucker-Muskian failures that run our society today. They are merely responding to the hole in our policy environment that guarantees that someone like them will always rise to the top. If Elon Musk ODs on Ket tonight, there will be an overnight succession battle among 10 horrible big balls, and whoever succeeds him will be indistinguishable from him. They are terrible people, and their name should be a stain on humanity, but we can't just fix this by replacing the people at the top. The problem isn't that Mark Zuckerberg is the wrong person to be the unelected leader of 4 billion people's social lives for life. The problem is that job shouldn't exist. And so this brings me to the real problem, which is the enshittigenic policy environment. The fact that policymakers in living history took decisions that we can identify that had the foreseeable and foreseen effect of turning the internet into a pile of shit. That they did this, that they got rich from it, they faced no disapprobation from it, and the policies are still in effect today. And by recovering that lost history of bad policy choices, this is how we get to a better world, because this is how we figure out what policies we need to unravel. And it's not hard to see what they are. It's going to be hard to get there. There's a joke from down east in Canada that goes, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here, right? The reason that before we decided to tolerate monopolies, we spent a lot of time preventing monopolies from being formed in the first place, is they're really hard to budge once they're there. But we do need to revive anti-monopoly law. And we took a good crack at it over the last 4 years. It's now in retreat here, but it wasn't just a US phenomenon. In Canada, where the Competition Bureau was so weak that in its history it had only challenged 3 mergers and had never successfully challenged a merger, they just got sweeping powers in 2024 to attack corporate concentration. We have the European Commission, we have the UK Competition and Markets Authority, we have action in France and Germany and Spain, in Australia, Singapore, South Korea and Japan, and China. So this is quite remarkable. All over the world, policymakers have figured out that they just can't tolerate monopolies anymore, for a combination of the public being so furious about the effects of monopoly, and also the fact that monopolies usurp the power of the state. And they've started to see this as an existential risk as well. So we need to restore competition. And as we restore competition, we need to restore regulation. Again, something in retreat right now. The European Commission and Canada are both walking away from their most muscular regulations because Trump has threatened them if they don't. But it is something that we need to do. We need to unionize tech workers. And it can seem like a bad time to unionize tech workers because, after all, the National Labor Relations Board under Trump no longer has even a quorum. So they can no longer act against unfair labor practices. But Trump has made a very important mistake here. He thinks the reason that we have unions is because we have labor law. And it's quite the reverse. The reason we have labor law is because we had illegal unions that fought for labor rights for so long and so hard that eventually bosses sued for labor peace. because the situation had become untenable. And the National Labor Relations Act that establishes the National Labor Relations Board, it's not just a set of rules for what your boss can and can't do to you. It's also a set of rules for what you can and can't do to your boss. And I'll give you one guess as to which half of that policy has been enforced most vigorously in the years since the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. So Trump thinks that when you fire the ref, the game ends. I say that when you fire the ref, you throw out the rule book. More people than at any time since the Carter administration in America favor unions. More people than at any time since the Carter administration in America want to join a union. And the unions are sitting on their largest cash reserves in living memory. It is time to unionize tech workers. And then the final thing we need to do is restore interoperability. We need to make it possible for people to fix the stuff that's broken, whether that's repair or disenshittification. And the fact is that it's a business. Apple's making $100 billion a year on payment processing, charging 30% to process every payment that's transacted through an app. That is a gargantuan markup. And as Jeff Bezos told the publishers when he started Amazon, your markup is my opportunity. These guys, they think that disruption is for thee and not for them. They think that when they do it, it's progress, and when we do it to them, it's piracy. We need to recover this. We need to seize the means of computation. We need to move fast and break kings. We need to kick them in the dongle. And the fact is that all over the world, countries signed up to not allow their own entrepreneurs, their own technologists to jailbreak and fix the things that Americans sold in their country, to protect Americans' margins and data theft on the grounds that if they did not, the US would impose tariffs on their exports. So happy Liberation Day. Trump's belligerent incompetence has created the circumstances in which every country in the world no longer has to fear tariffs because they are laboring under tariffs. And if that wasn't enough, Trump has also started using American tech companies as an arm of his war against the world, such that you have the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court swearing out an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu for genocide, Trump denouncing it, and Microsoft taking away the International Criminal Court's Outlook, making the chief prosecutor lose his documents, his email, his address book, and his calendar, right? So now you have every policymaker in the world wanting to run as fast as they can away from American infrastructure, both for their governments and for their businesses. And it doesn't stop with administrative software. If you'll recall, when Putin's thugs stole tractors from Ukraine and spirited them away to Chechnya, the immediate effect was that the John Deere company was able to send a kill signal to those tractors and permanently immobilize them, which is really cool if you're a cyberpunk writer, but really scary if you're thinking about the fact that all the tractors in your country are sold to you by John Deere, who now take orders from Donald Trump. This is a thing we were told China might do if we let them get into our telecoms. And you know what? It is a thing you should worry about when you have people in your telecoms or in your energy infrastructure, because after all, Putin's invasion of Ukraine sent Europe all the way through a solar transition where they went from being 10 years behind on solar to 15 years ahead, which is amazing news for the planet. But every one of those inverters, every one of those batteries is coupled to a Chinese cloud and could also be bricked at will. And the only way out of this is to legalize circumvention, to make it legal to jailbreak and fix things, to make them better, to install open source software in them. And I think this is our way out. I think this is the silver lining. I think life has given us SARS and we can make sarsaparilla out of it, because one country, some country, is going to defect from this. They're going to say, we want the hundreds of billions of dollars that our economy could rake in by raiding the margins of American tech monopolists. And we want to ally ourselves with the national security hawks who are legitimately worried about the tide of foreign great power clouds. And we want to ally ourselves with the consumer rights advocates, the privacy advocates, and the labor advocates who have been saying that these digital technologies steal our money, steal our dignity, steal our data. And so you put those three groups together: national security, entrepreneurship and economic policy, and human rights, and you get quite a sturdy tripod from which to launch an all-out assault on the worst companies that America has ever produced. So that's the thing I'm excited about right now.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you, Cory.
I would love everyone to make sure that you grab your copy of Enshittification. It's an amazing book. What we covered here really is just like skimming across the surface. It's a fantastic read. And as you saw from Cory Wright's, the way he talks, and it's so engaging to read through. As for thank yous, a big thank you to Cory for a fascinating and engaging conversation today, and to Dave Hansen and Authors Alliance for facilitating and for co-hosting this session. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.